have to make yourself a sympathetic character. Somebody has to be rooted for.
In 1971, Charles Bronson made the kind of decision most of us can only imagine in our darkest nightmares. He walked away from the role that might have rewritten history, a role that would have elevated him from gritty character actor to cultural icon overnight. Instead, he said no, he turned his back, and carried that regret like a weight on his chest for the rest of his life. Tonight we finally hear it from the person who knew him best, his daughter. She confirms the secret we've been whispering for decades, the truth we sensed behind those steely eyes, the admission he never dared speak aloud. Imagine a boy born into a one-room shack, its walls trembling with every passing freight car, its floor never warm enough to keep everyone under one roof at night. 17 people shared that shack in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania. No running water, no heat, no escape from the coal-dusted air that coated their lungs and stole their breaths. At 9 years old, Charles slipped a stolen cigarette between his lips, seeking a momentary reprieve from the itch of lice and the ache of cold bones. He smoked to feel calm, to hold a fragment of control in a life governed by hunger, fear, and relentless toil. Living next to coal tracks, just beyond the rail car's ceaseless roar, meant there was no silence. Every night shrouded in darkness, he reminded himself that survival wasn't merely living, it was outlasting every freight car, every mine collapse, and every coal-dusted dawn. Socks weren't a luxury, they were survival gear, handed from one sibling to another like a fragile lifeline. Dresses were uniforms worn from hand-me-down racks, his only shield against mockery in a classroom that whispered cruelty. At home, his father's return drunk was the nightly punctuation of fear, sending children scrambling into corners until silence swallowed them. By the age of 10, Bronson's father was gone, claimed by the same minds that consumed his breath. Suddenly, Charles's shoulders bore the weight of 17 starving mouths. He slid underground as soon as he could, crawling through black tunnels where a single misplaced foot could bury him alive. A week's work earned him $1. That dollar bought a day's ration of bread. One wrong move in the depths could trigger an explosion, a collapse, or a silent grave. He saw 4 men die in an instant when a shaft blew in 1927, 4 lives extinguished before he remembered how to pray. War arrived on his doorstep in 1943, a different kind of coal dust in the sky. As a B-29 tailgunner over Japan, he looked death in the eye 25 times. He froze at 30,000 feet, shrapnel tearing into his arms, the sky itself becoming hostile territory. His Purple Heart was a promise written in metal. Survival was a scar. Yet Bronson once said the war felt easier than the mines. In the cockpit, he wasn't a bullied kid. He was the hunter, perched above a world at war. Only the nightmares followed him home. The GI Bill became his passport out of Atlantic City's half-lit piers and carnival barkers' laughter. In Philadelphia, he heard a foreign word, theater. His accent was a punchline, but his presence was undeniable. He carried that coal shack grit into auditions, trained his body like a sculptor with stone, and reinvented himself from Charles Bukinski to Charles Bronson, a name plucked from a street sign, chosen to survive the ghosts of McCarthy-era suspicion. Bronson was born in the neon glow of Hollywood's promise, a living contradiction, too rugged for the stars, yet impossible to ignore on screen. He learned early that silence could kill with more power than a fist. A burp in a bakery line became his secret weapon. It earned attention, broke tension, and lit a spark in a kid who'd never felt seen. His first bit part in You're in the Navy now paid $50. His eyes heavy with coal dust and war pain, yet glowing with unspoken resolve. Directors noticed the lines etched into his face, each wrinkle a tale of hunger, each scar a chapter of survival. He didn't need polish, he was real, and Hollywood, starved for authenticity, found him irresistible. By 1953, Bronson was Igor, a hulking mute in House of Wax, terrifying without uttering a single word. That silence was his rebellion against a world that tried to tame him. He mastered glances sharper than steel, a gait measured and slow that spoke of buried storms. When Machine Gun Kelly offered him his first leading role, filmed in 8 grueling days on a shoestring budget, Bronson poured decades of coal dust, mine tunnels, and wartime clamor into a man cornered by his own paranoia. The film's success wasn't measured in dollars but in the tremor his presence caused across Hollywood's facade. In the wake of Boot Hill's scorching shoots, Bronson stepped into darker shadows, trading a bounty hunter's dust for the cold bars of prison walls in Big House, USA. He became Benny Kelly, an escaped convict fueled by desperation and memories of those endless coal seams. On the set's 3rd day, during a choreographed yard fight, his instincts honed in Pennsylvania's mines took over. His elbow caught a stuntman off guard, sending him to a nearby hospital. Instead of flinching, Bronson knelt beside the wounded man, pressing bandages with the same urgency he once reserved for shoring up tunnel collapses. It was a defining moment. Hollywood realized that this wasn't a polished star contorting for applause. This was a man who carried real grit in his joints, who could bleed on screen and make you believe every drop. And bleed he did. Critiques praised the raw authenticity of a man whose scars weren't just cosmetic but functional, each line on his face mapping years of survival. Then in 1957, director Edward Dmytryk cast him as Blue Buffalo in Run of the Arrow. Bronson, painted in brownface and carrying a bow he claimed from his wartime tailgunner's arsenal, navigated a Sioux chief's internal turmoil. Between takes he argued with co-star Rod Steiger over method versus instinct, fiercely defending his choice to embody emotion through silence and physicality rather than buried psychological minutiae. Their clashes became the stuff of legend. Steiger accused him of stoicism bordering on arrogance, while Bronson retorted that real, tangible action could convey more truth than 10 pages of soliloquy. When the camera rolled, that tension translated into a character imbued with unpredictable violence, moments of tenderness lurking beneath taut muscles. Audiences couldn't look away. They felt the crackle of control barely maintained, the promise that at any provocation, this man could erupt with lethal precision. A few years later, in 1959, The Magnificent Seven opened a new frontier. Bernardo O'Reilly was the quiet revolutionary who lent a crooked smile to dusty streets. Bronson negotiated a $50,000 paycheck unheard of for a supporting mercenary after realizing his worth in a roster that included Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen. On set, he remained aloof, sidestepping McQueen's scene-stealing antics and deflecting Yuli Wallach's friendly jabs about moving too much. Wallach, amused, hired a tally man to count Bronson's on-screen gestures. He moved fewer times than any principal actor, yet each blink, each slight step, echoed the tension of a man trained to scan horizons for snipers. When the film premiered, box offices roared, especially overseas, where critics crowned Bronson the quiet revolutionary. His reputation soared. He was more than muscle. He was an elemental force, a silent storm contained within a leather vest. By 1963, that contained storm found its tempest in The Great Escape. Though a minor role as Danny Walensky, the Polish miner-turned-soldier, seemed small on paper, Bronson treated every moment in the subterranean set as if his life depended on it. He insisted on digging actual tunnels rather than wooden facades, referencing mine plans he'd sketched decades earlier. The production schedule buckled under 6 weeks of subterranean toil, costing United Artists close to $1 million in today's money. Bronson worked 12-hour shifts, muttering historical details to the art director and improvising the collapse of a supporting beam during Walensky's death scene to capture genuine terror. The director, at first furious over budget overruns, accepted the extra cost when he saw the footage. Bronson's claustrophobia was raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. The movie grossed over $11 million, but more importantly, it changed Bronson's status from background gruffer to bankable name. Audiences whispered his character's name long after the credits rolled. Then came the 1967 explosion known as the Dirty Dozen. As Joseph Władysław, a man on death row turned reluctant soldier, Bronson waded through trenches of bullets and moral conflict. During the film's notorious chateau assault scene, his silent focus contrasted sharply with Lee Marvin's gruff bark. Backstage, tension erupted in a real fight. Marvin swiped at Bronson, who blocked and sent Marvin's nose to the floor in one swift motion. Production halted for 3 days, costing MGM another small fortune, but when cameras resumed, the two actors channeled that animosity into electrifying combat. Critics noted that Bronson's handling of weapons, every bolt-action rifle, every pistol, every grenade, stacked against his war experience, lent the film a pulse that surfaced long after audiences left the theaters. The movie raked in $45 million worldwide, and Bronson's cut, over $150,000, was a windfall, but the real victory was intangible. He'd proven he could anchor a blockbuster with a few measured lines and a stare cold enough to freeze any man's blood. From dusty mining towns to Europe's grand orchestras of studios, Bronson's rise followed an undeniable arc. Boyhood scars transformed into silver screen gravitas. But more than the numbers, more than the fights and the headlines, it was his refusal to compromise authenticity that defined him. When other actors chased lines of dialogue, he chased truth in dirt, in sweat, in the tension between breaths. Each role became a layering of his own battles, tunnels that almost buried him, aerial dogfights that nearly took his life, the echo of coal carts and the crack of rifle fire. By the time filmmakers whispered his name alongside Sinatra's and McQueen's, they weren't just praising a tough guy on camera, they were honoring a man who carried his past so deeply, every performance felt like a confession. Then came the film that rewrote his legend. Once Upon a Time in the West. Sergio Leone, the visionary director, conceived a character known only as Harmonica, a silent gunman whose presence echoed like distant thunder. Bronson, now commanding a price 5 times his earlier salary, refused a standard contract. He insisted on creative control over every nuance, demanding fewer lines, sharper silences, and a harmonica he would learn to play live on a scorching Arizona plateau. Filming stretched 18 grueling weeks under bleached sun and whipping wind, temperatures soaring past 110 degrees. Bronson rewrote 60% of the dialogue himself, trimming monologues to single words and silence heavy enough to choke a man's resolve. Every scene became a confrontation. In the famous train station showdown, Bronson stood framed by peeling paint and echoing whistles. He adjusted his harmonica strap with deliberate slowness, and the camera rolled. For 23 takes he coaxed a melody from trembling reeds, his breath ragged like a battle cry. Leone shouted "cut," and found the moment still too gentle. On the 24th take, Bronson froze mid-note, his eyes narrowing, harmonica trembling in his grasp. The director's nod was nearly inaudible over the wind. That single frame, that single breath became the film's spine. When Once Upon a Time in the West premiered in Europe, critics lauded it as a symphony of dust and steel. But in America, it stumbled. Audiences unaccustomed to heroic silence balked at the drawn-out pauses and foreign score. Yet Bronson had already planted his flag across the Atlantic. The role of harmonica earned him a moniker in Italy, L'uomo senza nome, the man without a name, and his visage adorned posters from Rome to Munich. For the first time, he stood not as an American tough guy, but as a cinematic archetype, a living myth, a whisper of vengeance carried on a lone wind. Bronson's European ascent accelerated in 1970 with the Mexican epic Guns for San Sebastian. Under blistering sun in Sonora's desert, he mounted horses at dawn, chased bandits through adobe villages, and endured the constant hiss of desert scorpions. During a tavern brawl scene, a bartender slipped on spilled tequila. Bronson caught him with a mid-stunt pivot, breaking his wrist. Without hesitation, he poured water over the wound, wrapped cloth from his costume, and kept the cameras rolling. That day, the crew dubbed him El Diablo de Desierto, the Desert Devil, a man immune to heat, pain, or defeat. The film netted modest returns in the US, but resonated with European audiences who craved authentic grit wrapped in operatic scale. Next came Villa Rides, the 1971 revolutionary saga filmed under Lieutenant Rodulfo Fierro's historical shadow. Opposite Yul Brynner, Bronson portrayed a figure who had once executed hundreds under firing squad orders. Before shooting, he pored over dusty archives, met with surviving bullet casings and local historians in Durango, Mexico demanding authenticity down to the caliber of ammunition. On set, he lined up 15 extras and ordered blanks to fall short, eliciting genuine recoil that left the extras staggering in terror. Directors frowned at the escalating insurance costs, but no compromise satisfied Bronson's appetite for truth. The finished film split critics. Some decried its brutality, others hailed it as a visceral study of power and regret, but all agreed, Bronson brought history back to life with a hand steady enough to kill and soft enough to tremble. In Europe, Bronson's fame soared again with the French thriller Rider on the Rain. Playing an enigmatic American colonel on a secluded chateau, he wove tales of Russian espionage with his native Lithuanian accent, punctuating monologues in 3 languages. During a nude scene, Bronson hesitated, until director Jack Conway offered an extra $50,000, enough to fund a small theater troupe in Paris. Under spotlights, he laid bare more than skin. He revealed vulnerability behind his iron facade. The film won a Golden Globe and shattered box office records in France, Italy, and Germany. Critics praised Bronson's chameleonic shift from cold gunman to wounded loner, noting that his quiet intensity remained the most eloquent dialogue on screen. Bronson returned to America as a different actor, no longer the faceless muscle in a supporting cast. He commanded rooms with half-sentences and incendiary glances. Yet with every success came whispers. Would he slip back into silence, hide beneath hats and dust? Would American audiences ever reconcile the man they knew from gritty westerns with the mythic figure Europe adored? By 1973, that question was answered in raw, pulsing violence. But first, a crisis closer to home shook him more than desert storms or cinematic showdowns. Jill Ireland, his wife and partner for 2 decades, faced a war no script could capture. Breast cancer seized her in 1975, sparking a fierce battle that unfolded beside trailers and tanning tents. Bronson, accustomed to wielding firearms in desert heat, found himself helpless against chemotherapy's cruelty. He stood outside hospital doors, hands clenched, breath shallow with dread. Jill's subsequent remission and relapse etched new lines into Bronson's face, not of rage but of grief and helpless love. Their marriage, once a fortress of shared ambition, became a testament to vulnerability. a rare fragment of softness amid his repertoire of iron wills. In the final frames of this chapter, we see Bronson not as a mythic gunslinger or mysterious stranger, but as a man who loved, who feared, and who carried regret as fiercely as he carried a gun. It was this blend of hardened truth and fragile heart that his daughter would one day speak for, confirming what millions of viewers sensed behind those haunted eyes. When she took the microphone, she did more than unveil a secret. She breathed life into every dusty footprint he left across history. 1974 arrived like a thunderclap, and with it came the film that would reshape Charles Bronson's legacy and ignite debates across the nation. Death Wish opened with a home invasion so raw and visceral that audiences recoiled, but they could not look away. Paul Kersey, a mild-mannered architect hardened by grief and loss, moved vertically across the city's underbelly, a man so familiar with shadowy corridors that he seemed to belong there. Bronson demanded realism at every step. He studied police reports, walked decrepit tenements, and analyzed crime statistics until the numbers haunted his dreams. When he finally stood center frame in that first brutal scene, his gaze bore into the camera as though it were a window into every parent's worst nightmare. Behind the scenes, tensions roared louder than any on-screen gunfire. Studio executives fretted over the violence, fearing a political firestorm. Critics branded the film irresponsible, arguing it celebrated vigilantism and would fan the flames of urban unrest. Protesters picketed theaters, placards raised high, chanting warnings that art had crossed a line into anarchy. Yet box office numbers soared beyond $22 million, an astronomical return on a modest $3 million budget. Bronson watched the headlines from his secluded Malibu retreat, reading op-ed columns that alternately worshipped him as a hero and vilified him as a monster. He remained silent, allowing audiences to debate his intentions, while he focused on the one truth he could not escape. The man on screen was a mirror reflecting the anger of a wounded nation. In press junkets, Bronson spoke of loss and regret with uncommon candor. His baritone voice, usually shuttered behind steel resolve, softened as he recounted nights haunted by nightmares of coal mine collapse and wartime fury. He confessed that Kersey's rage echoed his own, that each vengeful act writhed with the same desperation he once reserved for survival underground. Reporters leaned forward, sensing the subtle tremor in his words, an admission that the line between fiction and lived experience had blurred entirely. Families who had suffered real tragedies wrote letters, thanking him for giving voice to their silent ache. Others denounced him, accusing Death Wish of preaching bloodshed as the only remedy for injustice. Bronson absorbed both with equal gravity, knowing the power of his craft also carried a weighty burden. Meanwhile, his personal life unraveled and reformed in parallel drama. Jill Ireland, his wife and fierce partner for decades, battled a relentless cancer that no film could exorcise. Bronson commuted between sets, sometimes in Europe, sometimes in New York, and hospital corridors, his own heart fracturing each time he peered at her frail form. He found himself torn between the sanctuary of silver screens and the sterile whiteness of chemotherapy wards, each boundary bleeding into the other. In a rare interview, he admitted he envied the simplicity of his on-screen violence, a controlled outlet for rage, over the chaotic helplessness of watching a loved one suffer. Audiences heard his confession as a poignant bridge between heroism and humanity, and the image of the tough vigilante was forever altered by the tenderness of his private grief. Unwilling to let the Kersey saga end, studios greenlighted Death Wish 2 and 3, each sequel promising bigger set pieces and more elaborate confrontations. Bronson, wary of empty spectacle, negotiated fiercely to preserve Kersey's moral complexity. He refused to portray his character as an unstoppable juggernaut. He insisted each act of retribution carry a cost: physical exhaustion, emotional trauma, the nagging echo that justice exacts its own toll. Executives grumbled that audiences wanted a champion, not a haunted wreck. But Bronson held firm, reminding them that authenticity was his currency, and without it, the kinetic thrill of gunfire would ring hollow. Screenwriters reworked scripts to show Kersey pausing between shots, cradling his hands like a man aware that no bullet ever returns unchanged. In private moments between takes, Bronson often retreated to quiet corners, sketching scenes of long-lost coal shafts or writing half-spoken lines about regret. Crew members reported finding him scribbling in tattered notebooks, words about fathers and smoke and the ache of a woolen dress at 10 years old. These scraps of memory would later evolve into letters he never sent, notes to Jill expressing his fear of outliving her, apologies for roles he declined or accepted without thought. In those fragile sketches, the actor and the man converged. Bronson the legend faded, and Bronson the child survivor resurfaced. When Jill succumbed to her illness in 1990, Bronson retreated into a silence deeper than any character he had portrayed. The hard-edged persona that once roamed cinematic streets became an echo in empty studios. Rumors of Alzheimer's and bitter legal battles over his estate surfaced, painting a tragic coda to an epic career. Yet amid the turmoil, a peculiar act of generosity surfaced. A Kentucky chemist named Audrey Jean Canower, who had never met him, bequeathed her entire $300,000 estate to Bronson. His response to quietly donate every cent to charity spoke volumes of his enduring compassion beneath that steely gaze. His final curtain came in 2003, when lung cancer claimed the life of a man shaped by coal dust, war crucibles, and the glare of cameras. Obituaries hailed him as a quintessential action icon, yet the true measure of Charles Bronson was crystallized only when his daughter stepped into the spotlight. In hushed tones, she confirmed the secret that had haunted him most. The part he turned down in 1971, the very role that would become Dirty Harry, was a regret he carried like an unspoken scar. Eastwood's iconic swagger, forged from that wafer-thin script, reminded everyone that Bronson's path might have been different, but the shadows of foregone opportunity still lingered in his steel-blue eyes. At the end of her testimony, she offered a portrait of her father no camera had captured, a man who buried tenderness beneath grit, who carried an arsenal of unspoken apologies, and who, even in silence, fought his greatest battle with regret. That revelation reframed every dusty showdown, every echo of gunfire, and every whispered melody on a harmonica into the context of a life defined not just by vengeance, but by the human yearning for peace and forgiveness.